Poles Apart by Gene Willis. As everyone knows, penguins are found at the South Pole and never at the North Pole. At least, not until the day. The Pilchard Browns got lost on their way to a picnic. Mr. Pilchard Brown was in charge of the map. He told everyone to turn right at the snowman, which was wrong. Now, where they all were, on the other side of the world, Mr. and Mrs. Pilchard Brown, Peaky, Poots, and Pog, drifting toward an enormous, furry, white something. Is it a lion? Is it a tiger? Said Peaky and Poots. Is it a picnic blanket? Asked Pog. The enormous something looked them up and down. He had never seen anything like the Pilchard Browns before. I'm Mr. White, he said. I'm a polar bear. And you are? Parrots, said Peaky and Poots. Pork pies, said Pog. We're penguins, said Mrs. Pilchard Brown. What are you doing here? Wondered Mr. White. We're going to a picnic at the South Pole, said Pog. This is the North Pole, my friend, said Mr. White. The South Pole is 12,430 miles that way. Anyone can make a mistake, Mr. Pilchard Brown said with a shrug. Don't think of it as a mistake, said Mr. White. Think of it as the start of a big adventure. Maybe I can help you find your way home. I have often dreamed of being the first polar bear to reach the South Pole. Mom says we should always follow our dreams, said Peaky. Dad says we should always follow him, said Poots. Lead the way, Mr. White, said Mrs. Pilchard Brown. The penguins followed Mr. White over land and sea. Eek, said Peaky. Whoa, said Poots. Can we have a picnic now, said Pog. But it wasn't the best spot, so they followed Mr. White all the way to the United States. Howdy, said Mr. Pilchard Brown. Busy, said Peaky. Buzzing, said Poots. Can we have a picnic now? Asked Pog. Well, not yet, dear, said Mrs. Pilchard Brown. The U.S. was awesome, but it wasn't home, so they followed Mr. White all the way to England. How do you do? Said Mr. Pilchard Brown. Gray, said Peaky. Grand, said Poots. Now can we have our picnic? Asked Pog. Not here, dear, said Mrs. Pilchard Brown. England was charming, but it wasn't home, so they followed Mr. White all the way to Italy. Ciao, said Mr. Pilchard Brown. Wet, said Peaky. Wonderful, said Poots. I need to pee, said Pog. Not here, dear, said Mrs. Pilchard Brown. Italy was magnifico, but it wasn't home, so they followed Mr. White all the way to India. Namaste, said Mr. Pilchard Brown. Hot, said Peaky. Huge, said Poots. Put the python down, dear, said Mrs. Pilchard Brown. India was dazzling, but it wasn't home, so they followed Mr. White all the way to Australia. Good day, said Mr. Pilchard Brown. Faster, said Peaky. Fun, said Poots. Can we have a picnic now? Asked Pog. Soon, said Mrs. Pilchard Brown. Australia was bonzer, but it still wasn't home, so they followed Mr. White over land and over the sea, and on they went. Are we almost there? Asked Peaky, Poots, and Pog. It's not far now, said Mr. White, and they followed him left, right, all the way home. Please stay, Mr. White, said Peaky and Poots. You can share our picnic, said Pog. But the South Pole wasn't his home. He was a polar bear, and polar bears lived at the North Pole, which is why he said goodbye and traveled 12,430 miles all the way back to the North Pole, where he belonged. He'd followed his wildest dream and had the best adventure. He was happy to be home, but sad that he would never see a penguin again. But then, to Mr. White's delight, he did. Hello, how did you get here? He said. Then he heard a familiar voice. Someone put my egg in your hat, said Mrs. Pilchard Brown. Can we have our picnic now? Asked Pog. Please make yourself at home, said Mr. White, And they did, because even though penguins and polar bears live poles apart, friends are always welcome.